Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Finlay Johnson. I'm the COO of the Association for Electronic Music. This is part three of our metadata workshops, kindly hosted by our co-chairs, Chloe Johnson and Charlie Phillips. This is part of our series on metadata, looking at different aspects. You might remember at the very beginning, we did one aimed squarely at creators and artists. This one's around the future. Slightly different also in that we want this to be quite collaborative. So we'll record the first section that will remain as a kind of educational piece for members. But after that, we're going to pause the recording, and then hopefully where the real value lies is in the conversation and the discussion. So I would encourage two things. Please keep your camera on if you can, just because at the end it'll be easier to communicate. It's easier for Chloe and Charlie to see who's talking. And also feel free to put comments and questions in the chat, because we'll come back to those at the end, have a bit of a conversation about it, and figure out, future of metadata, but also the future for our work in that space as well as a trade association. So our thanks to everyone for turning up today. I'm going to pass it over now to Chloe and Charlie.
Thank you, Finlay. All right, I will share my screen. Here we go. While I'm sharing, I can't see anybody. So if anybody, maybe I can see people. Anyway, hopefully I can see my own screen. So welcome to Metadata for the Future. So as Finlay said, this is the third part in our series. We do have two other webinars that are available for members that dive into a little bit more of the details of how metadata is used, specifics around ownership metadata and royalty collection and how to license things properly. But this is really about where are we going as an industry in the future, and where have we been, and basically can we have a crystal ball and predict the future? So that's why I think the discussion at the end will be really interesting. So starting off with just this quote from our friend Bill Gates. Automation applied to an efficient operation will magnify the efficiency of that operation, but automation and technology applied to an inefficient operation will magnify the inefficiency. So I definitely think that for the uninitiated, I don't think anyone on this call would disagree that if the industry already has inefficient processes around data sharing or data management, let's say, and you apply an algorithm to it to try to fix it, it doesn't necessarily fix it magically. It might just make you have even more issues to try to comb through and deal with. So as technology is growing, as we're going into different areas, we're exploring things like AI, and we already have tons and tons and tons of data to comb through as it is. What do we do as an industry to try to mitigate, the explosion of inefficient data or inefficient processes? So we're going to split this first section into 4 parts. So the sort of hype versus reality, where have we been? Where do we think we're going? How can we start to think critically, basically? Because I'm sure if you're watching this even 6 months from now, things will have definitely changed or moved on from what we are talking about in this presentation. So taking everything from this first 30 minutes as a way to try to think about problems, way to approach different technologies that emerge and how we should be, looking at it as an industry. And then Charlie's going to walk you through some of the policy considerations, how we've adapted thus far, how we are adapting around our policies and copyright and licensing. And then kind of a brief overview of how the dance industry is, changing, how fans are engaging, how we can specifically in the electronic music world be on top of some of these technologies or thinking through those processes. So as Finlay mentioned, there are 2 sessions already available. If you are a creator listening to this and you want a general overview about the data that you need to be managing as a creator, then you can tune into session 1. Session 2 is also, artists very much should absolutely watch that as well, but it also includes the lens of larger organizations or companies that are handling the metadata on behalf of creators. And it goes very into detail on what is data. So if you do have any of those questions for us, please do feel free to put them in the chat if we don't get to them today, because they are more around these 2 sessions, and Charlie and I can chat to you afterwards. So hype versus reality. I pulled just a couple examples off the top of my head of areas in the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years where the industry has had to adapt to a technology that maybe at first people were a little bit hesitant about, then maybe experienced some kind of bubble and or complete you know, embracing of, and then, you know, where are we currently, where are we going, just to kind of put our thinking cap on around when a new technology or a new thing comes into our industry, how could we or how should we be reacting to it? So of course, digital downloads and streaming being the one we're all the most familiar with, very, very prevalent today, very embraced today. Obviously, we know that the piracy and the takedowns and all of that kind of stuff that was going on around the early days of digital downloads was maybe an example of the industry not always embracing new technology right away. We also have blockchain, and therefore by extension, the NFT craze that happened recently. You know, I used to work for a blockchain company. We no longer use the blockchain, but I'm very happy to answer any questions people have about it. But from my perspective, I feel like the sort of 2014, 2015, 2016 area where blockchain was starting to be thought about, and then people were kind of getting into it. And then 2017, 2018, it was like a buzzword and everyone was like, yeah, maybe I'll use it. Maybe I won't. Maybe it's going to disintermediate me. Maybe it won't. Then it kind of went away again. People had said, nah, it's not really working. It's too expensive. I can't pay for Ethereum. And then we had this NFT bump where everyone was buying NFTs for a crazy amount of money and people were trying to make quick cash. And then I think it's kind of starting to, dip again. But as a technology, as something that's, something that is not an immutable change log, basically, could be applied to so many different things and so many different industries. A decentralized way of communicating data is also super interesting, right? So it's not necessarily as a technology a bad idea, right? It's just how we think about it, how we try to apply some of these technologies, right? Virtual reality or augmented reality has been around for a long time, starting to get more and more affordable and more accessible for people. People can start using things, even on their iPhones and things these days. So that's also an interesting space because you're looking at things like adaptive music and generative music within those apps, within gaming, within attending virtual reality concerts and things like that. And then kind of at a left field one where I'm talking here about synthesizers and actually the evolution of electronic music itself, where you are going from something that's very like a large piece of technology that you've built maybe yourself and you're, kind of creating these synthesizers and these sounds yourself, to a digital workstation where maybe you have plugins and things like that. And you're starting to deal with lots of different descriptive data around those sounds and around maybe those waves that you're creating in the synthesizer itself. So it becomes kind of from an more analog situation to a digital world where then now you have data that can describe some of this. And then, of course, the change from DJing on some vinyl and now DJing on a USB stick is huge. And now you have all this different data that can be tracked and created and implemented in your system. And now we have today, I think the buzzword in every conference that I went to, at least this year, was artificial intelligence, AI. Are the robots coming for us? And so if we apply the same sort of like, well, where have we been? We've seen in this list above some things that people were very skeptical of and then have now become very mainstream, some things that people have had kind of, waves of enthusiasm about that maybe we're still not sure how it's going to work. New technologies that are starting to break through, are they going to make it? And that's kind of the context in which I look at any new technology. So AI has also been around forever and ever, and Charlie's going to go into a little bit more about that. But as a threat or as a tool or as however you perceive it, depending on who you are and the sort of opinions you have about it, it's really no different than the other types of technology that we've seen emerge, and either it will succeed and become something that everybody is using and we need to create new copyright laws around it, or it's going to become something that's kind of like, oh, that was fun. Remember when we did that? And it will move on. So every time you see big hype going on in conferences, I'm always a little bit skeptical, having gone through the hype engine a couple times in our own company at Verifi, to kind of say, I want to prepare for this if it does take off, and I'm not going to put my head down in the sand about it, but I'm also not going to necessarily jump on board and change everything about everything I'm doing until we kind of know where things are going. And where data fits in for each of these, just very quickly. So in the digital and streaming world, of course, licensing and copyright and who owns this and can I actually publicly perform this or make this available, and streaming was a huge, part of that. It continues to be a huge part of that, and making sure that we are getting correct, especially works data, to streaming services around how you license something properly, and then you can actually pay for that content. The blockchain, a lot of it was around the immutability of rights. So either writing your rights onto a blockchain, which was what Verifi was seeking to do in its early days, or creating sort of micro ownership. So the NFT type of thing where many different people can own pieces of your copyright and you are storing that in a sort of smart contract. Or you have smart licensing around blockchain where you are, creating a smart contract so that people can micro license from you, knowing that, hey, Chloe has said that I can absolutely use her song if I'm doing a documentary about saving the environment and it's this price, and I can just kind of immediately get that license. So that's one of the areas I was most excited about when blockchain companies were a lot more prevalent. I thought that was a really cool application, right? Virtual reality, augmented reality, again, I mentioned adaptive music, but also I think it creates different questions around how we would consider something a public performance, how we would license it, what's going into something, if it's adaptive, and it's literally being created on the fly, how do we license that? What is that at that point, right? And then as we're looking at digital workstations and plugins and stems and all of the different information that goes into, if anybody's ever logged into something like Splice and pulled some stems down, you've used descriptive metadata. You said, I want something in this key at this BPM. I want it to be kind of acid jazz or something. And then you're using that to, build new music and create new sounds. And then, of course, I think it's such a wonderful opportunity that, DJ Monitor and Pioneer DJ have joined forces to be able to make it easier for you to see what is being played in actual decks and what is, basically being publicly performed, and being able to, provide that back to the collective organizations who then can collect those royalties from the venues and pay those out. So that's a really cool application of technology for sure. And then, of course, we're all familiar with the fear of AI creating copyright infringement potentially, like make a song that sounds like Drake, possibly taking the musicians' jobs away entirely, especially around things like ambient music and video game background music and whatever else that, people are currently today making music or making money on being a musician, that very easily could be taken over by AI. And how do we, make sure that we are being good caretakers of creativity? Or maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe the robot overlords will take us over, But also, I think that's kind of the main topic that's been around these conferences. But AI has been around forever. And I think especially in electronic music, people can overlook the fact that if you're using any kind of sound changing device that's using algorithms to change a filter or something like that, or to use a tuner that's tuning something, you're using things that could, if you apply artificial intelligence to, can make your work so much faster, can make it so much more accurate, can really help you speed up the process of something you're doing, especially maybe around mastering. So it's not always necessarily just an AI is going to write you a song or steal your voice. It's also can be applied in so many different ways around just the creation of music and facilitating, that creation, as well as if you apply AI to something like cleaning up metadata or pointing out where there's incorrect metadata, that also could be a great application, right? So Charlie will talk a little bit more about that. And with that, I will pass over to him.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Chloe, and welcome everybody to today's session. As said, we'll go through the part one kind of led discussion, but the second part being much more discussion based. I'm really looking forward to hearing some of your views from your various different perspectives around what you're seeing in terms of what we're discussing today. But my little slot now is going to be looking a little bit around some of the kind of licensing implications. So kind of from a legal business affairs perspective, but kind of trying to make this relevant from the point of view of anyone who's involved in electronic music. Most of what I'm going to be talking about today is actually going to be around collective licensing to some extent. But because that's such a core area of where the money comes from in a lot of different contexts for electronic music generally, it will hopefully have some relevance for whichever perspective you're looking at it from. So Chloe, if you don't mind, you're in the driving seat. If you can just maybe just blast through the bullet points. So just to kick off, my sort of starting point, if you like, will be, again, it's almost kind of a historical observation to some extent that music and technology have this kind of intrinsic joined at the hip type of relationship. And as technology is advanced, it impacts or kind of creates what music is that we're actually licensing. And it also allows the licensing to therefore happen as well. So as Chloe was just talking about, machine learning based technologies they already play a role in all of our lives, whether you're looking at, you're using a search engine or you're using eBay or whatever. Those platforms basically are kind of driven by algorithm sets that guide you through an experience that allows something to happen that is kind of benefit, that makes the platform usable. And in the music licensing world, it's no different. So, machine learning technologies are already helping with things like customer service at collecting societies, for example. Pretty, day-to-day, fairly pedestrian example, but it's more efficient for a chat bot at a collecting society to be taught about the types of questions that members or users are going to have to that collecting society, and basically spinning up an AI-powered chatbot so that a huge amount of the day-to-day questions that would require a human to answer an email or read an email, discuss, someone answering the phone. There are several societies around the world that are now moving away from all of that to put the human beings into areas which is better for their sort of time and resource to be spent. And a lot of the really day-to-day pedestrian stuff being taken up by the machine, which is not a bad idea. Data cleansing is also an area which I think is a couple of the societies that I'm aware of, mainly on the producer side, on sound recordings. There's a few that are looking at this, but it's by no means prevalent. And there is no single kind of industry agreed data cleansing thing that people can use together, which would make possibly common sense, if not maybe even some commercial sense. So we're nowhere near that as a sort of future thing, but piecemeal examples of machine learning technology powering data cleansing is today's reality. So pretty interesting stuff. And again, I love electronic music. I produce electronic stuff, as everybody knows. And I love the fact that, you can get plugins and tools that are updating themselves behind the scenes through machine learning, so that each time you use it, you are using the kind of latest version that can adapt to what you're asking it to do. I think that's absolutely, we're living in an amazing time for creativity. So this technology can be massively helpful. But kind of in a similar way to, your plugin and the assistive type technology, what music is and what the listening experience is of music that is being licensed in order to generate or collect and generate revenue for creators of music is much, much more nuanced than just the kind of the mechanics of how this stuff works. And again, Chloe and I have kind of tag teamed a little bit on putting this session together, and there's a lot of common ground between what we're talking about. But one thing that is absolutely for certain is that things will continue to change, and that change will get faster and faster, because that's just kind of the way technology operates at the moment. But if we have a look at the next slide, let's have a think about where things look now in terms of some of the licensing and kind of policy considerations, but really we're looking at kind of how the rights work now. Is everything clear now before we start looking at what the problems might look like in the future? So I've just put a few, the kind of quite dry examples maybe, but these are real issues that are happening right now. But even in a world where we have established law and we have conventions that are set up at international level and are adopted into national legislation country by country, and around the European Union, for example, we still have a few grey areas. So whilst most areas of of the kind of licensing picture are fairly clear, there are in fact still, even under well-established law that's been around for decades, new things coming up that challenge whether or not the rights are as clear as we might think they are. Two examples I've put up on the screen are the RARP decision, which came from Ireland and is working its way through the European courts, and the AFEM Media case, which is a Spanish case that's also working its way through the European courts. Now, without going into any real detail, the RARP case is basically a question over nationality of an individual music performer and whether or not, in certain contexts, they're, as a national of a particular country, they're eligible for payment when their recorded performances get used in particular ways. Now, that's a pretty fundamental thing. You know, depending on my nationality, do I qualify or not? It's a pretty basic question, right? But actually, it's not that basic, and it's not as clear as one might expect, given the context of international comparative law and how different rights interact with each other according to one country and the next. So those sorts of contexts create quite a lot of problems. The AFEM Media case is also, again, it's an argument around existing law, but the question here is, a broadcaster is claiming that the point at which a sound recording is incorporated in an AV work, in other words, I produce some music with Chloe and together we tell a film studio that we're happy to sync that piece of music into their film, when that film or TV show, that AV work, is broadcast, the argument is that there is no longer a sound recording in the picture at all because it's been subsumed into just being part of the AV work. So there is in fact no sound recording anymore. Now that's the basis for most TV licensing of music. So it's kind of important that we're clear on that, right? But that is a new argument that's popped up that threatens to upset things. So even in the current world where we can be quite relaxed that most licensing is clear, actually, the present isn't that clear. It's not always as easy as it looks. Another good example is video on demand. I mean, this is much more of a practical point rather than a legal one. But when music is used in shows like Netflix, for example, and users, subscribers of a VOD service like Netflix, choose a show and watch that show in different countries, exactly who is collecting the money and who is responsible for licensing is not actually as clear as you might think. And depending on what type of rights holder you are, you may think, well, I want to do that myself. Others of the same rights type might think, no, actually, we should be looking at a collective structure for that. So Netflix and video on demand are not new, but even that not quite new technology is still not that clear in terms of making sure that no money's left on the table and that actually all the licensing is clear. If we move a step further into the kind of slightly more recent past and we look at things like live streaming, there are really quite open questions as to which rights are triggered when music, recordings, musical works and so forth are used in genuine live streaming contexts. Now we kind of know that it should be licensed, but is me doing a DJ live stream DJ show that people are watching, which rights am I actually triggering that should be cleared in that context? There should be rights cleared, but it's not always entirely clear what exactly the rights are in terms of that particular usage at that particular time. And Twitch is a good example of this, which we can maybe talk about in the discussion in a moment. But then I think moving up to where Chloe was saying, kind of in the kind of latest new big name technology being kind of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and generative content, it's genuinely unclear in terms of whether or not something that is a machine creation as itself is actually copyright protectable and whether the traditional rights really do function in that context or not. That is an open question to some extent at this point. So that's kind of where we're up to sort of right now, but the situations that were yet to exist are yet to exist. So let's have a look and see what might be coming down the future. So if you don't mind just plopping through those, thank you very much. So there will always be, as you can guess, in terms of the way the world works, there is always going to be a kind of creator drive to interact with some form of consumer demand and need. And I think that what's really interesting right now is looking at what in our current sort of version of a social media driven kind of consumer world, people crossing information into entertainment, people are colliding creating with consuming. It's all, there's never been more kind of cross-fertilized, I guess, than where it is right now. What does that mean in terms of what listeners and consumers and people who are looking to be entertained, what are they looking for? What do they expect? And I think it's pretty clear that what the current expectations are that are likely to continue is that people are going to want to expect things to be increasingly new. So I want something new, not been done before, some original experience. People are going to want, because they are expecting this already, things to be personalized and tailored towards themselves. And I think attention spans maybe are shorter. Don't know, maybe that's a controversial way of putting it, but music has been, in terms of a kind of longish form thing to experience, again, I'm choosing my words carefully, but that's been defined by technology and the ability to actually either have people playing in a concert hall or how long a recording can be stored on a particular medium. That's all been turned completely upside down and on its head. People are now expecting super quick TikTok video, Twitter, quick fire content that is also personalized and new and quick. So what that means is that we are now moving into a world that is completely cross-platform, completely cross-media. And as we look at things like the immersive experience that Chloe was mentioning a moment ago and the augmented reality universe, when you have experiential kind of creation of music, for example, that adapts in real time at any one point to a particular user, you're talking about a very different world to how the licensing structure and the rights were ever designed to accommodate. So that's kind of the demand side. On the supply side, it's reality that it is now so much easier to produce relatively good quality music, film, games, whatever, that there is an explosion, huge amount of oversupply. I'm not going to talk about quality or any of that sort of subjective stuff. There is just a lot of content being produced in every discipline because it's easier than ever to actually produce that. And then we need to think around how that supply, the kind of concept of supplying material that goes to a consumer kind of platform, the way that that material is accessed will change the way in which it's actually produced. So we can think about today's platforms, but AR, augmented reality type experiences will be very different to the linear experience of, I want to listen to music, so I will go to Spotify on my phone and I will find a track and I will press play and I will listen to that thing. That is already quite a kind of, it's a reflection of a past way of listening to music, and the industry that we're all in is still geared towards supplying music using quite standard data sets to supply that type of a listening experience, because that's what people have got right now. But when that listening experience changes and the way music is accessed is completely different, we have a lot of questions around how we describe the content to make sure that licensing can happen. Next slide, please. So we don't need to spend too much time on this because this is just a kind of an imaginative sort of picture of what the future might look like. If you take to their logical conclusions what some of these expectations might look like, we might be looking at a world not so far away where there is just the mass production of unique one-off clips of music or new little pieces that come up that are tailored to individual listeners. Could be, to my name or your name at a particular time in a particular place. It could just be a few seconds, and that's a continuous stream, as Chloe was saying, of kind of new unique one-off bits of music being created in response to anyone's individual situation, which may or may not be mixed into other things they're doing. It could still be a dedicated entertainment experience in a kind of like a virtual reality world, but it could be that actually you do expect to have your different music or whatever piped to you in your headphones as you're walking down the street at a particular time. Kind of taking the Spotify DJ, which is pretty clunky, but that functionality kind of exists already. But if you take that to a kind of logical conclusion, you could have a real-time curator that is not just suggesting music to you, but actually changing music to make it adapting to you on a one-off kind of individual basis at any given time. Assuming that that's not complete nonsense, which it may be, but if that is something that is likely to happen, and there is this constant creation of kind of new material, there would be a kind of like a swarm scenario where there's even more music and content out there than there is right now. How on earth do you track, report, and pay for all of those different items that are going to have rights holders in some form? Perhaps they're going to have users, they're going to have some form of licensing. How on earth does all of that tracking and reporting operate? Do we even know what would be licensable in those contexts? It would depend. It would depend on what was created under clear-cut rights structures that we understand. But there may be other things that we're not clear on, and who would do that licensing. And again, the final bullet point on the slide there is really, I was thinking about this from the point of view of collective licensing organizations. How does that type of a phenomenon actually completely upset the established business structures around licensing for broadcast, licensing public performance, licensing music in clubs and bars and shops and on the radio? Those are kind of established things that are going to be disrupted. They've already been disrupted. They haven't gone away, but they've been disrupted. But could this phenomenon of complete sort of atomic type of music, thousands and thousands of items being created at any one time, could it actually cut completely into what we already rely on for a lot of our industry revenues? Next slide, please. So moving on now, just to, again, a little bit of a sort of, not really a legal analysis, more of a kind of historical thing. But the question at the top is, let's assume that we're in a situation where we do have a whole new way of creating and listening to music. If genuinely new things like what we were just talking about are to occur, does this mean that there is in fact a requirement for the law to change? Do we actually need new rights? And the answer is that actually, yes, there would be. So I think maybe this is useful for anyone who is following any of the discussions around, what the DCMS are doing, or what other, sort of government organizations are looking at. If there is a genuine case that the creation or listening of music or any form of creative industry kind of output has changed significantly such that the existing law is out of date, then it absolutely is right that the law should change. And you can look, it's precedent that doesn't go back too far. When in the 80s and 90s, digital technology was moving very rapidly, and it was very clear that things like MP3s being piped around the internet were going to be a big thing, the world came together and the WIPO treaties were, thrashed out and drafted in Geneva and implemented into national law in the mid to late 1990s. So all of our digital licensing actually is kind of, to some extent, pegged onto rights that were developed not that long ago. But the question is, have even those legal mechanisms become outdated? And if so, what would need to change? So I think there will be a requirement for certain concepts that we're very used to needing to be changed. And I think the terminology, if nothing else, will need to change. But I think the meanings of some of those terms will need to change too, because a lot of the terminology and the foundations upon which licensing is built today is still kind of an echo of the 1960s, actually, in terms of a phonogram being a specific thing that doesn't just mean the concept of the recording, but actually like sometimes even the recording itself, like a phonogram produced commercially and released to the public in reasonable quantities, doesn't really mean anything, but that is still one of the linchpins around which broadcast licensing is hung, for example. So even we've managed to accommodate changes to the way that the sort of practicalities of music distribution used to be in terms of modern distribution. But I think the distribution question will change so much in the near future that some of these fundamental legal principles will actually be unfit for purpose and will need to be changed. So that's the kind of quick race through some of that sort of stuff. Chloe, next.
Sorry, I missed a definition.
No, that's okay. I mean, the making available is exactly the same kind of concept. It happens to be a broad enough term to work quite well from the 1990s WIPO treaties. But is that going to be enough if it's not even enough to describe whether or not a live stream is licensed under that regime or whether it's licensed under a different type of non-interactive regime? There's a bunch of stuff that's going on here. And I think I'm conscious that I'm talking a lot and I'm talking quite quickly. But I think what is probably the most important takeaway is that we have a present version of licensing and technology it's pretty good, but it's not perfect. And there's a lot of grey areas in there. But in the future, there will need to be quite a lot of changes, but it's on us as an industry to be perhaps a little bit more open-minded about joining together the dots and digits on the metadata side to at least accommodate the ability to change and adapt to change the way that the change is going to inevitably be coming to us. Over to you, Chloe.
Wonderful. Thank you, Charlie. So yeah, just to kind of summarize, I think the main way that I try to, in my own world, both as like an artist manager and at Verifi, try to connect with what's happening now and where are we going, is to always look at the actual consumption of the product that you are selling. So our audience are our fans, the people who are listening to electronic music, who are, as of time of recording, doing a lot of these things on screen, but maybe in 6 months, 5 years, whenever you're watching this wonderful timeless recording we're making right now, there will be differences. There'll be new things that we haven't even heard of, right? So while people are spending a lot of money going to clubs and festivals, going to see live music, the pandemic was a big question mark for a while from us, like, when will these venues get back open? Will we see the numbers coming back, flocking to the festivals that we saw before, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think live music is going anywhere for a while, and I think it's growing. But then maybe in 20 years, who knows, there's some other kind of pandemic-like disaster, or we just can't leave our house because it's too hot because climate change has happened. And now we're experiencing live music in a completely different way from, our underground bunker, whatever, right? So we just don't know in any of these things that we feel are just like, this will never change. Anything could, right? We have streaming services, which everyone's, familiar with now. Everyone probably got their Spotify Wrapped and Minds Your Years and all those things this last week. But even that kind of is changing, right? So as Charlie said, streaming becomes also part of number 3 and 5. It's like the gaming and interactive piece. You're experiencing music, through games sometimes. And there's, I think Steve Aoki, just did this recent thing where it's like, you can remix music and then you can put it in the game and then I'll look at your remixes and stuff. Like, they're beginning to try to communicate with fan bases through these mediums that we maybe as a general music industry aren't really paying attention to right now, which is a huge opportunity for us as electronic musicians. Social media, we talked about Twitch briefly, about like the questions around the streaming and how you license things for live streams. How do you police those places? How are you interacting with artists? And if you are communicating with other fans on spaces like Discord and you're doing kind of fan-made sort of, it almost becomes like you're not even a fan anymore. You're like also a musician who is interacting with those artists, and you're creating all of this sort of derivative content or user-generated content, et cetera. And as Charlie was saying, short form, personalized, remixed, all of this becomes, I think, part of the way that people are engaging with and consuming and experiencing the concept of music as an art form. So it's no longer just, there's a DJ back there and I'm dancing around, or there's an artist up on stage and I'm listening to it or I'm buying their music. It's like you are becoming more and more part of that experience through, things like adaptive music, the commercially very easy to digest and understand DAWs that are starting to come out that are like not as complex as learning something like, Ableton or something, right? And like it's putting music back in the hands of people like that maybe previously didn't have access to it. Like, what do you do when music becomes that really large machine, right? So no matter when you're watching this, so if you're watching it, 2 weeks from now, I would always say, like, look at, again, the audience. How are people consuming music? What is the demand? What are the younger generations doing? How is Gen Alpha starting to communicate and understand the apps on their phones and like how they are interacting with content? And, looking at that as our future, right? The children are our future, but in reality, like these are the generations that are going to start creating the next thing that we're doing. So looking at those trends and understanding those is also a kind of a good way of trying to predict where we're going to be in a couple of years' time. And then just to kind of, this is animated, I didn't know, sorry. Just to review quickly, oh, it's gone away, this slide. So this was part of a previous webinar we gave. I did it again. And third time's a charm, you guys. It's going to happen. Amazing. So we did go through this in great detail, which is, taking examples of metadata, looking at the recorded side and, who is involved in that, the distributor label, the neighboring rights collection, the different types of copyright that are being collected and the royalties associated with that, who you need to license things from. Same on the purple side for publishers, CMOs, PROs, so if anybody does, especially if you're watching this and you are creating a new technology or a new platform or a new software, and you're maybe not necessarily from the music industry, but music is a huge part of what you're doing. This is a really good starting point to familiarize yourself with what are all these codes, what is all the rights associated with it, who do I need to go to obtain these licenses, and thinking about that early, especially if you're a startup, is so important, because you don't want to get 2 years into development time, have this amazing app and go, this isn't viable for my business because I actually can't afford the licenses, or I didn't get the licenses, or what have you. So a little PSA to make sure you check out that second series webinar if you do have any questions around that. And then as a general sort of summative slide, so this is also from a previous presentation of just how do we work together as an industry? How do you remove those inefficiencies, going back to the Bill Gates quote? And how do you actually create better, efficient processes to facilitate things like licenses on a scale that a human can't deal with? How do you clean up massive catalogs that are growing every day? Again, that a human can deal with. How do you make sure that each of the publisher, label, distributor, DSP, CMOs who need to exchange data with each other are able to do so in a secure way, in a way that doesn't, undermine their business or their processes, but allows enough information to get out there and be starting to be connected, that it doesn't become sort of an individual problem, and each DSP having to clean up their own data set, each CMO having to clean up their own data set and figure out what's going on. Like, as a holistic industry, are there ways that we can make this a little bit less, full of friction, and a little bit easier to communicate? So going back to what Charlie was saying, like, how can we, if we're preparing for the future, it's not just preparing for AI or preparing for a certain policy change or preparing for a new way of consuming music. It's like, how do we get the groundwork of data, whether it's ownership data, which is mostly what this slide is kind of talking about, but also things like the descriptive and objective metadata that's going out in ERN messages that need to be communicated, and how do you send back sales information to people, and how are you doing this in a seamless kind of way? So food for thought. I don't think anybody has really the answers, but it definitely is something that from my seat at Verifi, I feel like those discussions are starting to happen a lot more frequently at the top at really big, high-level organizations, which is really encouraging. It's not something that I felt I saw even like 5 years ago. So I do think we're moving in the right direction, but it's important that we are doing our best to try to involve ourselves in those conversations. If you are a data evangelist, like, shout from the rooftops, because people do need your expertise. They do want your help. They do want your perspective. And making sure that we are, especially from the electronic music side, I think, to kind of bring back to like why we're all here for AFEM, making sure that people, when they are thinking about changes or they're thinking about opportunities even, that they're not just thinking about the top 50 pop music, and that they're also realizing like, hey, there's a whole set of problems or opportunities that exist when you're looking at something like electronic music. And that not everything is a live performance of a jam band at a bar, that there's also these live performances of pre-recorded music, and there's remixes, and there's things happening live on stage. And, maybe all of us here are a little so in that world, we think that everybody knows that, but they really don't. So again, just making sure people use their voices whenever you have a space to say like, hey, have you thought about the fact that, a 5-hour set that was recorded at Tomorrowland that goes up on YouTube is maybe not licensable in the structure that you're licensing it, things like that is really, really important. So it's not just about how we can work better in our own companies, but how we can be better sort of, I guess, advocates for this genre, basically, is my soapbox speech. And with that, I will leave it to Finley and / the discussion.